a brain power quantity production line. Colonel Sidney Mashbeer used that phrase about the section he ran on the outskirts of Brisbane, and he did not mean it as praise for anyone's cleverness. He meant volume. Most of the men who reached him had come by way of a converted Civilian Conservation Corps camp in the Minnesota woods, where they spent months at desks working through captured enemy mail and diaries, a letter home about rice, a page with 4 days of weather on it and nothing else. The ordinary paper of an army read until reading it became fast. What that produced was speed, and speed is the whole point of this story. On the 19th of May, 1944, a small wooden box came off a submarine at Darwin and was flown to Brisbane. 2 days later, its contents lay in front of 5 translators. 2 days after that, the Imperial Japanese Navy's plan for the decisive Battle of the Pacific War existed in English, run off on a hand-cranked mimeograph, moving toward the American officers who were about to fight that battle. Not one man in Tokyo believed those documents still existed anywhere on Earth. The Japanese Navy had closed the file on the 17th of April. To understand how a set of enemy operational orders ended up on a bamboo floor in a Filipino fishing village, the place to start is a runway of open water off Palau on the last night of March. American carrier aircraft had been working over the anchorage. Admiral Koga, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, had already moved his headquarters ashore and had decided to move it again, 600 miles west to Davao. 2 4-engine Kawanishi flying boats were laid on. For security, Koga took one and his chief of staff took the other. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome went aboard the second aircraft with 14 staff officers and a briefcase. In the briefcase was a bound copy of the ZEED plan with a red cover, an air staff study on carrier fleet operations, the rules governing use of the codes, and a list of place name abbreviations. A third machine, carrying communications and clerical staff, ran late and lifted off 3 hours behind them. Of the 3, only that one reached Davao. Koga's flying boat went into an enormous storm front and then into the sea. There were no survivors. Fukudome's pilot tried to work around the weather, found Davao unreachable, turned north for Manila, and found Manila unreachable too, because the headwinds had eaten the fuel. Cebu lay 6 miles off. The pilot came in steep and misjudged his height. Fukudome, expecting a crash, grabbed at the controls to lift the nose. The machine over-responded and struck the water at about 2:30 in the morning, and the airframe settled into the Bohol Strait roughly 2.5 miles from the beach. Then the wing tanks let go, and burning fuel spread across the surface around the wreck. Fukudome got clear with a bad leg, took a seat cushion for a float, and swam away from the flames as hard as a man in his condition could. He did not look for the portfolio. He watched the machine go down and concluded, on entirely sound reasoning, that the documents had gone down inside it. 12 other men were alive in the water around him, and 12 were not. 6 miles up the coast sat the enemy headquarters for the Central Philippines. He could see landmarks he knew, and his whole problem was the shore. The box did not sink. It had been built to float, and it floated out of the wreck and onto the current, and it worked its way in over the next 2 days. On the morning of the 3rd of April, a shopkeeper named Pedro Gantuang Goko, in the village of Perilos, saw something in the water off the beach and sent a neighbor named Opoy Wammer out in a boat to fetch it. Wammer opened the slimy, oil-covered thing and found a red leather portfolio inside. He decided the contents must be important, which was the right conclusion arrived at for the wrong reason. He was going on the quality of the binding. Gantuang Goko told him to leave the box in the boat, anchor the boat a couple of dozen yards off the sand, and wait until dark. At noon that day, Japanese soldiers came down the beach hunting for exactly that object. They went over the sand. Nobody swam out to the boat. That night, the 2 men brought it ashore, opened the portfolio, and found 6 packets of soaked paper, some of the bundles quite thick. They spread the sheets on a split bamboo floor to dry. The next day, they carried them to another house and dried them for a second day, then repacked them and buried the box. There was also a pouch of small gold nuggets inside, and they kept it as spoils of war. The record does not say what became of the gold. What the Japanese Navy did next deserves attention because it was not sloppy work. Tokyo sent out a signal reporting Koga and his staff missing, ordering the affair kept quiet and giving it a cover name. It would be referred to as the Otsu incident. Search aircraft went up over the strait, ground troops went through the villages, and the Navy brought in its own tide and current specialists who did the one genuinely rigorous thing available to them. They took boxes of similar size and buoyancy out to the crash position and released them to see where the sea would deliver them. The boxes came ashore at Perilos every time. Troops searched the village twice. They assembled the residents and asked whether anyone had seen a box, and everyone said no. They went through the houses and found nothing, though they left convinced the thing was somewhere within a few hundred yards of where they were standing. Then, a reward was offered, rice and cloth to start with, and later a figure of 50,000 pesos. Nobody spoke. Perilos was burned. Elsewhere on Cebu, the pressure was worse, and it fell where that kind of pressure always falls. Villages went up. Civilians died. That is the part of this story that gets skipped, and it should not be. Gantuangoko had a box buried near his own house and soldiers walking his beach for the third time, and he decided he wanted no further part of it. He gave it away, gold and all, to a local guerrilla. Around the 9th or 10th of April, it reached the headquarters of the Cebu Area Command in the hills above San Fernando. A former mining engineer named James Cushing ran that organization, several thousand Filipinos and Americans under arms, and he now owned the problem. Cushing had a second and more urgent problem in front of him. The 10 survivors from the aircraft had been taken by villagers and marched inland, and they were now in his camp. His personal doctor was treating Fukudome, who had been carried on a stretcher for the better part of a week and was running a fever of 104. Nobody in the camp knew who they had. Fukudome had given a false name and a false rank, took the title of general from everyone who used it, and answered in fluent English without correcting a soul. The radio message that went to Brisbane reported a captured Japanese general and asked for orders. The orders never arrived in time. Messages from Cebu were relayed by way of Mindanao and Negros and were taking 3 days or more to reach Australia. By the 9th of April, Japanese columns were closing on the ridge where Cushing was camped. He had 25 soldiers in hand against hundreds of theirs. A float plane was working over his positions, and he had reports of more than 100 Filipinos rounded up to be used against him. Late that evening, he made terms. He would return all 10 survivors if the reprisals stopped. The Japanese commander at Cebu City agreed, sent back a note commending him for it, and expressed the hope of meeting him again in the field one day. On the morning of the 10th, the prisoners went back down the hill. Fukudome rested, flew to Manila on the 15th, and went on to Tokyo. By then, Cushing had the box, and Brisbane's problem had inverted into the exact opposite of Tokyo's. The Japanese were hunting for documents they believed were still on the island, while the Americans were trying to move those same documents off it without anyone noticing they had gone. Cushing rolled the papers tight and sealed them inside 2 empty mortar shells to keep the weather out. He handed the shells to 2 former prisoners of war, Russ Snell and Jimmy Dyer, and started them across Cebu on the 15th of April. They crossed the island, crossed the Tanan Strait, and reached Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Andrews on southern Negros on the 28th. 13 days on foot and by small boat, with an enemy sweep running behind them. In Brisbane, MacArthur's intelligence chief was reading the traffic and getting nervous in a specific and professional way. Charles Willoughby's concern was not whether the documents were valuable. It was that the value would evaporate the moment the enemy suspected they had been recovered. He put that in writing, warning against inflating their apparent importance any more than security absolutely required, precisely so that the Japanese would go on believing the sea had taken them. Everything downstream of that memorandum was shaped by it, including the choice to disguise the pickup as a refugee evacuation. The submarine was the Creval, patrolling off northern Borneo, and she got her orders at 11:30 at night on the 7th of May. She was to be north of Basay on Negros at sunset on the 11th. Her captain, Francis Walker, watched the beach through the periscope that afternoon and saw boats forming up. The local district commander came aboard first and told Walker there were 41 American civilians waiting, not the 25 he had been briefed for, 21 of them children. Walker said, "Bring them." 40 came down the hatch in 38 minutes, and with them came a small wooden box, handed up with the message that MacArthur wanted it badly. The Creval ran on the surface as much as her captain dared, because a boat carrying 40 American civilians and a foreign navy's operational plans out of occupied water is not a boat that can afford to be careful, and he traded caution for speed the whole way south. She was sighted and attacked more than once. Twice she took a working over from depth charges before she could get clear. On the morning of the 19th, 2 Australian boats met her off the coast, and an American officer came aboard to collect what he called the mail. The box went ashore at Darwin into a courier's hands onto an aircraft, and 1,800 miles later it was in Brisbane. By midday it was open on a desk. The men who opened it were relieved to find plain language rather than cipher. The physical evidence told them most of what they needed before a single character got translated: red covers, official seals, and a portfolio of a kind nobody carries around for routine paperwork. Photostats came off the copier that same morning and went to Mashbur's 5 best translators, men who had spent 2 years reading the private correspondence of enemy privates and who now had the operational orders of an entire fleet spread across a table in a suburb of Brisbane. The first hard fact they established was administrative. The document was copy 6 of 550. That single line settled the argument about authenticity, because a forgery does not carry a distribution number from the middle of a real print run. It was Secret Combined Fleet Order Number 73, issued from the flagship Musashi at Palau on the 8th of March, signed by Koga, and its opening paragraphs stated that the combined fleet would bring its combined maximum strength to against an enemy fleet occupation force and hold the vital areas. The operations were to be called Zed operations. The rest of it fought them, and for a reason nobody had planned for. The Imperial Navy used its own internal place names, and the translators were army men, so Wake Island turns up in the document as Otori, and there were naval technical terms that meant one thing to a fleet officer and nothing whatever to a linguist trained on infantry diaries. They worked through that night and straight through the following day. Mashbeer then sat down at a hand-cranked mimeograph himself and ran off 20 copies of the finished 22-page document, issued on the 23rd of May as ATIS Limited Distribution Translation Number 4. The first copy traveled by officer courier to General Marshall in Washington, and the second went to MacArthur. At Pearl Harbor, Edwin Layton read it and did not like the naval vocabulary. He could see it had been rendered by people who did not live inside a fleet, and the Marianas invasion force was already assembling at Eniwetok. He signaled Brisbane for photostats of the Japanese originals, got them 2 days later, and put a small team from the Joint Intelligence Center on a complete retranslation. When it was done, he judged that Brisbane had it substantially right. Copies went to every flag officer connected with the operation. A flying boat carried Layton's version out to Eniwetok, where it reached Raymond Spruance aboard the Indianapolis on the 8th of June. Mark Mitcher's carriers had already sailed from Majuro, so copies were dropped to the Lexington at sea. This is the point where the story usually gets larger than the evidence will carry, so it is worth slowing down. Koga was dead. Somu Toyota took the combined fleet on the 1st of May, and inside a week he had modified the plan and renamed it a Go. The document Spruance was reading described a scheme that the man now running the Japanese Navy had already altered. What the Americans held was not a schedule. It was the shape of an intention: land-based air as the main striking arm, the fleet cooperating, everything committed to one engagement, and a set of assumptions about where that engagement would be fought. The National Archives account of the affair, assembled from the message files themselves, states plainly that how much this knowledge contributed at the Philippine Sea cannot be answered. Historians have not settled it either. What is not in dispute is what the man carrying it did next. Spruance did not chase. The Japanese decoy operation on the 19th of June was built to pull the American carriers west, away from the Saipan beachhead, into the reach of shore-based aircraft that could shuttle between Guam, Tinian, and the fleet. The document in his hands had described exactly that combination. He stayed where he was and let them come to him, and the Japanese air groups broke themselves against a fleet that was waiting in the right place with the right posture. On Cebu, the account was still being paid. Cushing kept sending material out through May while Japanese aircraft worked over his area day and night. On the 17th of May, leaflets came down across the island addressed to him by name, demanding that everything recovered from the aircraft be handed to the mayor of San Fernando by the 30th, with severe consequences, promised otherwise. On the 30th of May, his headquarters was overrun by surprise and he lost men getting out. The bombing and strafing continued into the middle of June. The second batch of documents, when it finally reached Australia, turned out to be 2 volumes of decoded radio traffic from late 1943 through the 29th of March, mostly concerning code changes. It went to the Allied Code Breaking Unit in Australia. There is nothing in the record to show that Tokyo ever learned the plan had been read in English. Fukudome was given the 2nd Air Fleet in June, took the 10th Area Fleet in January of 1945, and survived the war. Cushing survived the war as well. Long afterward, asked about the weeks in the mountains, Fukudome explained why he had let an American guerrilla commander go on addressing him by a rank and a name that were not his. "I did not think it necessary to correct him as to the title," he said. He had been carried through the hills on a stretcher by the men who had his fleet's battle plan buried in a village behind him, and as far as the surviving record shows, no one ever told him where it went. There is a queue of these going up here, all built the same way, out of the message files and the translations, rather than the legends. Subscribing is what keeps them turning up.